Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Back to the Bible with Bible teacher Bryan Clark. Today, Bryan introduces you to the all-powerful God of creation, who actually longs for an intimate personal relationship with you. Later in the program, Bryan will join us in the studio to answer questions and discuss some practical ways to apply today's lesson and help you move forward in faith. Now let's go to Bryan Clark with today's message.
When Moses wrote chapter 1 of Genesis, it is not written as an argument. It is not written as an apologetic. Nobody is trying to prove the existence of God in the Bible. As a matter of fact, there is just an assumption that God is and that God created. This is fact. It is stated as fact, and the rest of the teaching rolls right out of that because God doesn't prove himself to anyone. God simply is. And that is the flavor of Genesis chapter 1. One of the questions the skeptics would ask is, how did Moses know everything that he knew in chapter 1? In other words, let's imagine that Moses was just kind of winging this. He was just giving it his best shot. How could he know what he knew and recorded in chapter 1? Moses was groomed to be the next Pharaoh in Egypt. And on that journey, he received the finest education the world had to offer. But when Moses wrote concerning the origin of the universe, Moses wrote something contrary to everything he had been taught. So if Moses wrote contrary to everything he had been taught, how did he know this? Here we are, thousands of years later, and the more sophisticated our equipment and technology gets, the more people are amazed because thousands of years ago, the ancients were wrong and Moses nailed it. His description of the universe and how it came to pass is completely consistent with science. Even though there have been theories all through the years that disagreed, it's turned out they were wrong and Moses was 100% accurate. And the question is, how could that be possible? Take, for example, verse 16, when Moses talks about the sun and the moon. From viewing just with the naked eye, when he says that the sun was greater than the moon, he's talking about size. That's what the word means. With the naked eye, it is very obvious that the moon is larger than the sun. And in the ancient world, everyone believed that. How did Moses know that the sun was actually bigger, greater than the moon? But he didn't call it the greatest, because we've now discovered the sun isn't the greatest. There are many planets that are greater in size than the sun, so he didn't say that. How could Moses use such precise language and find out thousands of years ago he was exactly right? I'm really glad you're struggling with that question, because Peter Stoner, who is a scientist, he's a mathematician, he too struggled with this question. His expertise was in the law of probability. And so he took Genesis chapter 1, he listed out all of the things that Moses recorded and what he called them and how he recorded the details, and he put his science to Genesis chapter 1 and asked the question, what is the probability, what is the likelihood that Moses could have been guessing? That Moses could have been winging it and hit every one of those correctly in Genesis 1. This is what he says. Those things, and he's making reference to all the things listed in Genesis 1, those things are not only correctly named and listed in their proper order, but also Moses' chances of writing Genesis 1 in that way by accident would amount to 1 chance in 31 sextillion. If you want to write sextillion in your book, it's 31 with 21 zeros after it. The chance of 1 in that. Now, to come to grips with how big this is, he goes on. He postulates a raffle with that number of tickets. In other words, 31 sextillion tickets in this raffle. To print them would call for 8 million printing presses, each capable of producing 2,000 tickets a minute, running day and night without stopping for 5 million years. One of the tickets is marked. Our chance of drawing that one ticket on the first try would be the same as Moses' chance of writing Genesis 1 by accident. I mean, the laws of probability make it very obvious, even if we look at it from a scientific point of view, that this had to have been a divinely inspired chapter. There is no other explanation. But there's some other things about Genesis chapter 1 that I find interesting. One of them is the way that Moses describes creation. If we were going to set out to describe the wonder of creation, we would write volumes. As a matter of fact, people have written volumes out of Genesis chapter 1 to try and describe the majesty of all that God has made. Moses does it in just a handful of sentences. As a matter of fact, if you look again at verse 16, when we think about creation, when we think about the universe, one of the first things that we think about are the stars and the galaxies and how vast all of that is. You talk about understatement. Look at verse 16 when Moses records the creation of the stars, something that we are so impressed with, and yet Moses records it so nonchalantly. As a matter of fact, it's recorded almost in passing. It says at the end of verse 16, oh, by the way, that isn't in there, but that's my interpretation. Oh, by the way, he made the stars also. That's it. That's his description of God creating the stars. And if you really go back to the original text, the words he made aren't even in the Hebrew. The only thing he said is the stars also. I mean, you talk about understatement. You talk about kind of a nonchalant, by the way, in passing, he did make the stars. Compare that to the way the National Geographic describes our universe. We used to think that the universe was simply our Milky Way galaxy. Today we know that galaxies are as common as blades of grass in the meadow. They number perhaps 100 billion. How does one comprehend the incredible size of this galaxy-filled universe? For such an awesome distance, scientists and astronomers think in terms of time, and they use the telescope as a time machine. They measure space by a unit called the light year. The distance light travels in 1 year at the rate of 186,282 miles per second, about 6 trillion miles. The only way to measure the vastness of the universe is with a measuring device called the light year, which is the distance that something travels at the speed of light in 1 year's time. Now, to understand how big that is, if I was to take a .22 pistol and I was to shoot it from here and it was to go all the way around the earth and come back and go right through me, it would do that 7 times in 1 second at the speed of light. Now imagine how far that bullet would travel at the speed of light in an entire year. And that's the only device they can figure out that's big enough to measure the expanse of the universe. And even then, they can't begin to comprehend how big is this universe. And Moses describes it this way. The stars also. Why does he do that? It's because the focal point of Genesis 1 is not creation. The focal point of Genesis 1 is God. Moses does not want us to worship creation. He wants us to worship the God of creation. In 31 verses, God is mentioned 32 times. The star of the show are not the stars. As big and as vast and as impressive and as majestic as all that is, it is merely the very breath of God. So how much bigger is God? How much bigger is God? And that's what Genesis 1 is all about. It is about the awesomeness of God. It is laying a foundation that will be built on throughout the rest of the Scriptures. God is this big. God is this awesome. And everything builds on that. If Genesis 1:1 is true, then nothing else recorded in the Bible is a problem. No miracle is a problem. No promise is a problem. Nothing said about life after death is a problem. None of those things are a problem if God can breathe and the universe comes to be. So everything comes back to a belief related to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Now let's return to Bible teacher Bryan Clark and today's study from Genesis 1.
I want to close our time just by walking you through several passages that illustrate how much the Bible builds on what is stated in Genesis chapter 1. One of my favorites is in Job chapter 38, chapter 39, and 40. Job was a man that suffered incredible losses. He went through a very severe time of suffering. And in the midst of that, as we all do, he questioned God, why does it have to be that way? And of course, when we do that, we question the wisdom and the character and integrity of God. And so God spoke to Job, and in chapter 38, God sits Job down and says, Job, let's have a little talk here. You've kind of questioned my ways, and I'd like to chat about that. That's kind of the living version. And Moses says, or God says to Job, tell me, Job, where were you when I hung the stars in space? Where were you when I put the sun where it belongs? Where were you when I formed the boundaries of the oceans and I measured the earth and I put out the universe? And God goes through this discussion in chapter 38, 39, and part of chapter 40 saying, Job, tell me, where were you when I did all these things? And in chapter 40, in the first couple of verses, the text says that Job put his hand over his mouth and he said, I will be quiet now. Job got the message. God was going back to Genesis chapter 1 and saying, Job, you're not me. I'm God and you're not. And Job said, I think I'll be quiet now. In Psalm 8, you have what I consider to be the greatest text for understanding our self-esteem and who we are to be in our own eyes and in the eyes of God. And it's really a text about David marveling at the wonder of creation. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy hands, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained. Then he asked the question, what is man that thou dost take thought of him, and the son of man that thou dost care for him? Yet thou hast made us a little lower than God and hast crowned us with glory and with majesty. David is wrestling with Genesis 1 type stuff. He looks at creation and the vastness of creation. He looks at Genesis 1 and says, a God this big, a God this awesome, a God that seems so transcendent, so far beyond us, how could that God care for us? And yet he has made us in his image and longs to be intimate with us. But the wonder of that is built upon the truth of Genesis chapter 1. In Psalm 19, there is a discussion about the God of creation and how creation communicates the wonder and the majesty of God. And once that's been established, which is Genesis 1, then it goes into a discussion about God's communication through this book. But before we marvel at God's communication through this book, we marvel at the God of all creation and how he speaks through what he has made. So the writer of that psalm establishes the wonder of this book by going back, in a sense, to Genesis 1 and establishing the God of creation. I noticed an interesting thing throughout the Psalms. It is very common in those Psalms when people are questioning, is God big enough to deliver me? Is God big enough to protect me? Is God big enough to do what needs to be done? The writers often go back to Genesis 1. The writers often go back and say, this is the God who made heaven and earth. This is the God who breathed and the universe was put in place. And they go back to Genesis 1 to say, yeah, this God is big. This God is big enough. Whatever you're going through, whatever your struggle, whatever your trial, whatever your burden, whatever seems to be hopeless, the psalmist say, hey, this is a God that breathed and the universe came to be. I think he can handle anything. That's the same argument that Paul makes in Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1, Paul is dealing with the sufficiency of Christ, that Jesus Christ is sufficient for our every need. And when Paul wants to convince us that that is true, what does he do? He goes back to Genesis chapter 1, and he says, this is the God who created the universe. And not only did he create it, but he sustains it. He keeps it in place. He keeps it going every day. And if our God, Jesus Christ, is that big, then he is sufficient to meet our every need. In Romans chapter 1, Paul says that every person who has ever lived on the face of this planet is without excuse in terms of knowing that there is a God, because God has made himself known in the wonder of creation. So Paul goes back to Genesis chapter 1 and says that makes every man without excuse because it is evident in creation. We could spend a month talking about passages that build on the truth of Genesis chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 1 lays the foundation upon which everything else in the Bible is built. This is the Creator God, and in the beginning, God created, and everything flows out of that. But of all of the passages that we have looked at, the one that continues to amaze me the most is in the Gospel of John, chapter 1. And the reason for that is this. At the beginning of that chapter, John goes back to Genesis 1, and he identifies that Jesus Christ is that Creator God. That everything that has been created was created by him, and apart from him, nothing was made. But then he goes down to verse 14, and he says, that God became flesh and dwelt among us. When I study Genesis chapter 1, I can almost not believe John chapter 1. Because when I study Genesis chapter 1, that God is so big, that God is so awe-inspiring, that God feels far away. That God feels so big that I could never have a relationship with him. He couldn't even know I exist on this planet. He is so big, which makes it so hard to imagine that the truth of John 1 could be true, that God became flesh and dwelt among us, allowed himself to be nailed to a cross for the forgiveness of sin, that we might be intimate with him. That almost seems impossible to believe. But the God who is so big in Genesis chapter 1 is also the God that longs to be intimate with you. And to make that happen, he came to this earth, lived as a man, died on a cross, that each of us might experience forgiveness of sin, that we might know him intimately and personally. That's the wonder of this God. In the beginning, God created.
Up next, Bryan Clark joins Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole and author Kara Whitney in the studio for some candid conversation about today's message.
So, Bryan, you mean to tell me if I can believe what Genesis 1:1 tells me, then I'm way down the road in my faith walk?
I think if Genesis 1:1 is true, then everything else that follows in the scripture shouldn't be that hard to believe. If God created everything, then it's not difficult to believe that he sent a flood or even the resurrection. So it's a key starting place. Is it true or is it not true?
I have a friend, George. He's a nuclear scientist and an atheist. I'm way out of my league trying to argue science with him. So how in the world do I talk to him?
Well, first of all, I never talk science with a scientist in terms of a debate. I'm a pastor, I'm not a scientist. And so I quickly acknowledge I can't converse at that level. But the fact is that many of the greatest scientists in history were Bible-believing Christians. So his argument doesn't hold up. There are Bible-believing Christians who have led the way in almost all of the disciplines that define our culture. But I've also found over the years, people get really creative in ways to avoid God. So they kind of talk in circles and they convince themselves that's why they don't believe in God. At the end of the day, the question is a truth question. Does God exist or does he not? And everybody has to ultimately decide that.
That's really a great point. So maybe I don't argue with George, but maybe it's, does God exist? I mean, that's really the name of the game.
Yeah, so one of the things that's really important to remember is we're not trying to win an argument, we're trying to win a soul. Those are two completely different things. So it does affect how we approach the whole conversation. So George is obviously really smart, and he's scientifically smarter than either of us, any of the three of us. But George is still a person made in the image of God, and he has hopes and dreams, he has pains, he has questions, he has struggles. So I want to build a relationship, I want to be in the conversation, and something's going to happen in life. It's probably going to cause him to rethink what he said to you, and in those moments, I'd like to be there to be some help. We're not just trying to get something said, we're trying to get something heard.
Yeah.
And those, again, that's a completely different approach. I can't out-argue him. I just want to love him, and there'll be a moment where we'll have a better conversation.
I mean, this is a big God, and it's hard to believe that he would consider having a relationship that's personal with us.
Yeah, so I think the purpose of Genesis 1 is to create this picture of a big God. Mm-hmm. So you come out of Genesis 1, this God is so big, he seems unknowable. I think that is the intent of the writers. And then you get into chapter 2 and all that changes, where God will present himself as uncomfortably intimate. So we'll get there in our study of Genesis, but I do think it's helpful to think about, and this is how the scripture consistently uses the concept of a creator God, is whatever it is you're going through. So we have listeners that are battling cancer. We have those that have rebellious children. We have those whose hearts have been broken one way or another. And the reality is God is big enough. God is big enough for whatever we're going through. And that's where the whole conversation starts in Genesis 1, is whatever it is you're dealing with, we do have a God that's big enough to handle it. And that's where our theology starts.
It's pretty cool.
Thanks for taking time to be with us today. If you'd like to listen to this message again, please visit us at backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. You're listening to Back to the Bible. Bryan Clark will be back again tomorrow with more timeless truths from the book of Genesis to help you grow in your relationship with God. Here on Back to the Bible.